Good morning, everybody. Thursday morning, our third of four modern Jewish thinkers for our summer series. And I have the great privilege to share Dr. Nehama Leibowitz. Henceforth, I will call her Nehama because that's how she introduced herself to everyone, and that's how she wanted to be addressed, even though her scholarship and her credentials are tremendous. But part of honoring her is honoring her own way of thinking about herself and the way she valued personal relationships. So I will be referring to her as Nehama. Um, and what I want to try to do in the time we have is cover a brief biographical sketch. One might argue that it's that Nehama Leibowitz doesn't fit into the canon of modern Jewish thinkers. She was not a philosopher. She was not a a proponent of a broad perspective of Jewish thought. In that sense, a more natural fit in modern Jewish thinkers would be her brother, Professor Yeshayahu Leibowitz, who very much was a Jewish public intellectual and someone who, a polymath who spoke on all kinds of topics. He also wrote what were called notes on the weekly Torah portion, but his areas of comment and writing were far, far more expansive. But what I want to argue this morning is that while she would call herself simply a Torah teacher, that there really is a worldview. There is an approach to Judaism, to Torah, and to Jewish thought, and to Jewish living that one can glean from who Nechama was and what she taught. And if I were going to try to summarize that briefly, I would say it is a fascinating combination of traditionalism and open-mindedness, which we'll see. She was herself a deeply pious, religious, traditionally observant person who was profoundly open-minded when it came to a pluralism of voices in study of Torah. However, she had her limits and her red lines. Um, and she was also a profoundly inclusive person in terms of welcoming anyone and everyone to study with her. However, she had her parameters. Story is told by one woman, Rachel Salman, who I think I have a quote from in a later section, who describes how she had heard all about Nechama and wanted to come study with Nechama, but she was not a proficient Hebrew reader. And she reached out to Nechama. Nechama said, "Come to my home," and just invited her to do a little bit of reading. And she really couldn't. She was breaking her teeth. She couldn't get through a simple pasuk, a simple verse. And Nechama found her a chavruta, a study partner, and she told them, "Go read the entire Chumash out loud together to one another. Just read through the verses, beginning to end. When you've completed that, come back." They did. They read through the whole Torah. They came back. Nechama welcomed her warmly into her classes, and she became an avid student of hers for decades. She said Nechama never called on her to read because she was sensitive to not wanting to embarrass her Hebrew reading skills. Um, but she, corresponded and communicated with her extensively, and this woman became a great scholar who wrote, beautifully on Nechama's approach to Jewish commentary and text. So, she had standards, and yet was profoundly inclusive and welcoming. I think, her the other way I would describe her contribution was a holistic view of Torah, an integrated view in which Torah is not merely an academic study. It truly is a guide for life, and one has to read it for its messages for how we live our lives on a daily, moment to moment basis. And yet, if we take Torah only as a guide for how we live our lives and not a profoundly deep text of study on its own terms, we're also bereft of understanding the gift of the Torah. I think as we read and discuss some of her philosophy, we may find ourselves sort of saying to some of it, this is obvious. I've long thought this about how Torah should be studied and utilized in our lives. And we might also find ourselves saying, why is she so limiting? Why is she not even open to broader ideas and approaches? And I think what I want to say about those two reactions, the first one is, well, then Nehama has done her work. Meaning, if we look at her philosophy and approach and say, yes, that's obvious, what I want to impress upon us is that's because of her influence. Torah study was not done in the way that she describes, with a holistic view of many commentaries, ancient and modern, and then taking its application to our daily lives, really wasn't done widely, deeply, and profoundly until she introduced it. And as a teacher of thousands upon thousands of people, many of whom, dozens, if not hundreds of whom, became themselves Torah teachers, her influence on Jewish students of Torah as well as non-Jewish, on the Israeli educational system of how Chumash is studied, is enormous. And so the things that we learn about her that we take for granted are in large part because she made them the norm. Um, and the areas in which we might see her philosophy or thought and say, this is limited. Why doesn't she expand beyond these horizons? I think are areas where perhaps she laid the groundwork for a more even progressive, inclusive view. But I think even today, she would not accept certain approaches to the study of Tanakh. And if we do accept them, that is certainly our prerogative. But we understand that we're standing on the shoulders of a giant of Nehama Leibowitz, a giant who might have said not to stand too far beyond her own shoulders. So these are just a few opening thoughts. What I want to do, so much has been written about her. There are a number of wonderful biographies by Chayuta Deutsch, by Yael Unterman. Um, there's a delightful book which I really have enjoyed called Tales of Nehama by Leah Abramowitz, who interviewed dozens of students of Nehama after Nehama died and relays a lot of their stories and accounts, and then includes a number of seminal articles about Nehama's approach to Torah study. Another great book. And if you Google her, you can find many great articles. An article by Professor Mark Bretler on thetorah.com that really takes you through her approach to Jewish text. And the Lookstein Center's website has a number of articles. There's a lot. And I wouldn't be surprised if on this call there are people who learned with her. And if so, I hope we'll have a chance to hear from you. I never had that privilege, but certainly many of my teachers were students of hers. And she corresponded with many, many people with her weekly Parsha sheets, which we'll talk about. She probably marked and returned over 40,000 of her gilionot, of her Parsha sheets. So she was just an expansive personality, an incredibly connective and caring human being, all of which kind of came together in her philosophy of Torah. So what we're going to do is a few biographical notes. I really want to include her own writings, even though she didn't write Jewish philosophy. I'm sorry, hold on. Great, sorry for the interruption. So I really wanted to include some of Nehama's own writing, even though almost all of it simply is her analyses of different portions. But we'll take a few of her slightly more programmatic writings to get a flavor of her own way of thinking about how we learn Torah. And then a couple of excerpts from studies of her to get a flavor of kind of who she was, a few personal anecdotes before we conclude. So that's what we're going to try to cover. Let me share my source sheet. I'll try to make sure that you can see and hear everything on the sheet as we go. And delighted to have everybody here as we embark. So Nehama Leibowitz was born in 1905 in Riga and died in 1997. I truly think that no greater accolade in her mind could be given to her than Chumash teacher and an author of studies of the texts of our Torah. Not just the Chamisha Chumshei Torah, the 5 books of the Torah, although that's where she focused, but we'll also see some essays in which she writes about the teaching of Nevi'im, of prophetic texts as well. She was incredibly well educated and incredibly well read. In 1919, so you can see as a young woman, her family moved to Berlin, and she was educated in a number of German universities. There's some apocryphal um, stories out there about her intersection with the Lubavitcher Rebbe and Rav Soloveitchik, who were all three of them were in Berlin at the same time, but they did not ever occupy the same classroom as far as is known to scholars and historians. But you could see it was obviously an incredibly rich and ripe, time and place for modern Jewish scholarship. She got her PhD in 1930 from the University of Marburg, where she wrote about some Yiddish commentaries or translations of the Torah. A little bit further afield from her focus area as a teacher of Chumash, but you can get a sense of her breadth. And simultaneously to her more secular education in German universities, she was studying Jewish studies at the Hochschule für die Wissenschaft des Judentums, the higher institute for the scientific academic study of Judaism. So she was familiar with more critical methods and academic approaches to Jewish studies. And in a sense, her position sort of was a middle space between classical traditional study and academic Jewish study. She married her uncle in 1930. It was a wonderful love affair, despite his being a good number of years her senior. She said it later in life that it was the best decision she ever made. His health was not wonderful, and she, was both a spouse and to a degree a caretaker in his older years. He died in 1970, and she lived close to 30 years after his death on her own. When they moved to Israel in 1930, she never left Israel again, except to go back and bring her parents 6 years later to Israel. She was an ardent Zionist and a deep, deep lover of Israel, and profoundly committed to living in Israel, and often corresponding with students of hers who moved out of Israel to Jewish communal positions around the diaspora. She always expressed an admiration for their work, out in the diaspora, and yet, but you should really come back to Israel. She was very firm on the idea that the place of the Jewish people was in the land of Israel. Professionally, she was a teacher and taught in a variety of teacher seminaries across Israel, and held positions in a number of universities in Bar Ilan and Tel Aviv University and in Hebrew University's overseas program. But most of her students learned in her apartment, where she taught weekly classes over many, many years. She expanded her reach through what were known as the Gilionot, the kind of editions or handouts in which she would, on a weekly basis, analyze a particular passage or section of the weekly Torah portion. It was not a global view. It was very much focused, but it was also rarely only on a single verse. It would be a chapter or a subsection of a chapter, and she would, do a treatment of it from different perspectives, looking at the different commentaries, and add on at the end a number of questions. The questions would either have no markings on them, or they would have one X, or they would have two X's for difficulty level. And she, distributed these, mailed them out, and students all around of all different stripes and walks and backgrounds around Israel and beyond would work on these and send them back, and she would mark them and return them. So this was an incredible, before the age of the internet, an incredible kind of correspondence that she kept up through Torah study, with just thousands upon thousands of people. When she sent out her last of her Gilionot, when she closed the project in 1971, she wrote an amazing letter, which is printed in, I believe, in the introduction to the volumes of her collected studies on the weekly Parsha, in which she writes about the joy in the profound diversity in age and gender and observance level and everything, of the students that she had the privilege to correspond with, and the deep inspiration she got from the passion of the Jewish people to study Torah. She got the Israel Prize for Education in 1956, and again, the 2 years younger sister, Professor Yeshayahu Leibowitz. They had a very close relationship, and communicated, argued, visited, very, very regularly. One story is told about a time when he came over unannounced, and she had company, and they stepped into the kitchen and chat, and someone who was there overheard, their voices raised, and they had a passionate argument about something, and she said something to the effect of, "That's not what our saintly father would have said." So there was a deep family tradition, that they each honored in their own way. Um, so I want to begin with her approach to Torah study. How does one study Torah? Um, Really, the only book that I'm aware of that she wrote besides her collected studies on the Torah portion was this book called Torah Insights, which was a series of essays on teaching Torah, and on topics that she hadn't covered otherwise in her studies on the weekly parsha, which was a kind of expanded version of her weekly parsha sheets, such that it had 5 to 10 essays on each of the weekly parshiyot, which combine some of the parsha sheets. She would return to topics in multiple years, and that's kind of, if you want to study Nehama Leibowitz, you get her studies on the weekly parasha, Iyunim beparashat Shavua. It's, I think, 7 or 8 volume work, because a few of the 5 books of the Torah have 2 volumes on them. And I know for a number of years, Rav Avi was teaching that before shul began on Shabbat mornings, and it's just a wonderful, wonderful study. You have to get used to her style of writing and the way she analyzes. It's incredibly rich, and you see there the breadth and depth of her knowledge, which we'll see as we dive in. So in this essay called Teaching Nevi'im Achronim, Teaching the Latter Prophets, the Haftorah of the second day of New Year, meaning the Haftarah for the second day of Rosh Hashanah, from Jeremiah chapter 31, she uses it as a case study of how to teach the latter prophets. And she was, not just a teacher, but a teacher of teachers. And so she writes very thoughtfully about, how do you make sure the lessons are dynamic and exciting? How do you interest young children and teenagers in parts of the Torah that could be dry or difficult to access? And she offers guidelines and tips and an approach to how to teach. And so this article really is written for teachers. And she opens up by talking about how difficult the teaching of the latter prophets is. For those in our Thursday morning class, we've been slogging through over many years. The poetry is dense. There's really minimal narrative. It feels repetitive. And she acknowledges all those challenges and tries to, map a chart, a path of how to do this effectively. Along the way, in this essay, she talks about 3 stages of how a teacher should prepare and then deliver a lesson. But the first stage is, how do you read the Torah? And I think she expresses some things that are very beautiful here. So she writes, you can see, by the way, that it begins, this article should be read with a copy of the Haftarah in Hebrew, open in front of the reader, meaning you're not allowed to be a passive reader of Nehama Leibowitz's writings. She tells you, you want to read and understand what I'm saying to you? Open up Jeremiah 31, have it in Hebrew in front of you, so that as I'm talking to you, you can actually do the study and engage in the Torah learning itself. And she writes, when teaching a portion of scripture or any other subject for that matter, the preparation should always be in 3 stages. We're going to focus here on stage number 1. First, study the text as such. Do not worry about how to teach it. Do not ask yourself how to convey it to your class or how to construct the lesson. Forget about how, and start by considering what. She offers a little homily here. In the words of the Shema, first let these words be on your mind. Let these words be on your mind. And only then, the next verse of the Shema, teach them to your children. Right? First, you have to take them in before you can teach. Teach it to yourself by reading it once, then again, then a third time. That is the only way. First, obtain an overall impression of the whole, and only then go into detail, to the paragraphs, to the verses. Consult the commentaries and the midrashim, and then return to the whole. This is her programmatic idea. You have to encounter the text on its own terms, with nothing intermediating it, multiple times for yourself, and just ask what, first and foremost, whether you're planning to teach it or write about it. First, you have to learn it, and to learn it, you have to be awash in it. And of course, she says, consult the commentaries and the midrashim. This is one of the lively areas of debate between her approach and the kind of modern Israeli school, which sort of is a little bit more of a direct reader access and says, don't be overly biased by the commentaries. She didn't feel that way. She felt, of course, you have to read it, access it, and take it in for yourself. But then the primary study is the study of the commentaries and how the text was understood over the generations. If you have an interpretation that none of the commentaries had, it's not automatically wrong, but it's suspect because they were our teachers and guides over so many centuries. This applies to all lessons. Now let us deal with our Haftarah. Now, after this, she goes about stages 2 and 3. Now she's going to come to apply it to the text at hand, Jeremiah 31. We are completely going against her rules because we don't have Jeremiah 31 in front of us, just for the purposes of getting through a little bit more of a coverage of her. In fact, I actually wanted to open up by saying that I think in this class, there are two ways in which the way we're going to study Nehama is completely antithetical to the way she would want us to study anything. The first is that she was profoundly humble and didn't want her personality to be studied. She wanted Torah to be studied in her honor or in the ways that she believed in. She said many times to her students, write about my books and Gilyonot, not about me. So with her, with seeking her permission or forgiveness. And second, the fact that our conversation and teaching is in English is something that, while of course she wanted everyone to be able to access the text, she was a deep proponent of Hebrew. She taught Ivrit be'Ivrit in, long before it was popular and widespread. And she was a strong proponent of Hebrew instruction. So with those caveats, we're doing our learning. So here's how she applies it, just for a little flavor of her poetry and the way you read when you read through the lens of Nehama Leibowitz. So she says, we start by reading the Haftarah, the first 19 verses of chapter 31. Maybe when we're not that far from Rosh Hashanah, second day of Rosh Hashanah, the beautiful Jeremiah 31. When we come back to it on Rosh Hashanah, maybe her words will echo in our ears. You, the teacher, are no doubt familiar with it from a number of past New Years, right? You've heard this on Rosh Hashanah for a number of years. You may even have taught it to a few classes. But all the same, try to read it again as if for the first time, letting the words be in your eyes as new, quoting a rabbinic dictum about the idea that Torah should be, fresh every day as though we received it right then from Mount Sinai. After reading, perhaps even while reading, you begin to visualize various scenes. The remnants of the people who escaped from the sword, a young girl attired with drums going out to dance, the hills of Samaria, right? That's what Mount Ephraim in the Haftarah refers to in Jeremiah. Vineyards whose watchmen are calling on people to go on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. A large congregation including frayed and dejected captives returning from exile. Rachel in mourning, Ephraim lost and wandering. The impression is one of alternating joy and weeping. Read it a second time and see how the joy is gradually rising up above the sound of crying. Read it yet again and notice the periods changing, the distant past, the recent past, the present, the future. The scene keeps changing as on a revolving stage, the desert, the vineyards of Samaria, the longed-for Zion and the temple, the distant isles, the road leading up to Israel, fields, gardens, and vineyards, Ramah on high near Jerusalem. Only after letting all these impressions of visions and sounds, of the freshness of streams and flourishing gardens sink in, can we now go back again, this time to read it all slowly and in detail, to work and try to understand the specific constituents. So when we read prophets, we're so often just like, what does this mean? How did one verse lead to the other? She sort of says there's so many registers at which we want to read. We want to read and visualize. We want to read and see the changing of the scenes. We want to read and notice the time periods. We want to hear the emotional registers and how they're changing. And all of that is just the very first level before we then come to, to study the individual words and phrases. Thank you, Leela, for your, kind and generous appreciation of Nehama. She truly was amazing. Okay, so just on to a second text now, which she talks more broadly about the project of reading, and about the personal place in the study of Tanakh. This is an essay also from her Torah Insights called "Joseph and His Brothers: How to Read a Chapter of Tanakh." And this is really just the introduction before she even gets into the, her real method. But I think it's just a beautiful meditation on reading that spoke to me. So she says, again, this article should be read with the original Hebrew open in front of the reader. We're going to be reading chapters of Breshit, the story of Joseph and his brothers. You have to have the text in front of you. She writes, let me begin with 2 introductory notes. 1, the topic which I formulated in the title, How to Read a Chapter of Tanakh, seems to me, now that I see it printed on the proof sheets, to be unparalleled frivolity. Not only because it is not up to me to teach people how to read a chapter in Tanakh, as I have not been entrusted with the keys to that book, but also because it is doubtful in general whether an individual can establish a reading process for the many. Should not each individual attempt to establish his own reading, a reading suitable to his spirit and soul, just as his spirit and soul comprise a unique and one-time phenomenon in this world? So his reading of Tanakh, his understanding of the text, should be a one-time phenomenon, uniquely his, and not an imitation of something else which once was. It's a beautiful appreciation, and this is a religious statement. We're all created in the image of God. We're all unique, and therefore our reading of a text will be unique. No one else will have quite the same approach. And I think she would also agree that our approach will differ from year to year or life stage to life stage, maybe even day to day. So how can you even say how to read a chapter of Tanakh? Nonetheless, she will lay out some, principles for us, which are in the essay. Happy to share that with you another time. But she goes on. Ludwig Strauss, and this essay was actually dedicated to Ludwig Strauss, someone I'd not heard of before, who was a poet and literary critic who lived in Germany and was maybe 20 years or so her senior. They had some correspondence and interaction, and she highly regarded his approach to text. She writes, Ludwig Strauss taught us, according to the formulation of Nathan Rothenstreich, that true reading is the completion of the work of literature as though it were taken from the potential to the actual. Reading a poem is a reproduction which the reader accomplishes by means of his voice and soul. It is true that the reader is bound to the printed word. He does not, however, merely absorb it into his soul. He gives it expression from within his soul so as to bring the letters to life. The relationship of words to a living work is like that of an architect to a constructed house. The reader is true in his reading to the blueprint, but it is he who builds the house of literary creativity from the material of his voice and soul. She goes on to say, so we can understand how hard it is to tell somebody how to read. Next paragraph. If in spite of this, we are still trying to teach reading, our justification is that the instructions given to the builder, namely the architect's blueprint with all its verses, words, and letters, are the precise data, the objective facts, the authority. It's towards the understanding of these and the acceptance of their authority that we wish to lead the reader. And this is what our teacher, Ludwig Strauss, taught us in his lectures, meaning we do recognize we have a starting point. We have the text in front of us, and it's to our own process of articulating that we want to learn. That's number one. And her caveat number 2. I learned to read Tanakh from our great medieval commentators, Rashi, Ramban, and Rashbam, and from their successors, who to some extent followed in their footsteps, including Malbim and the Netziv, Rav Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin. In approach and method of explanation, they may be far apart from one another and from the basic approach of Ludwig Strauss. Yet they and Strauss have something in common, something which I regard as very important to teach. This is the serious importance which they attach to the written word, to every word, not only the major words that possess deep religious, philosophical, and ideological significance, such as Kedusha, holiness, Mishpat, justice, Tzedakah, charity, Chesed ve'emet, right, loving kindness and truth, or Segula, but even to the Vav HaChibur, the prefix meaning and, but, or, literally the letter Vav that comes at the beginning of a word, right? They attach serious importance even to that. They took this serious attitude and paid this serious attention, not only to the gravity of the words, but even to their sequence, to the sentence structure, repetition, parallelism, to everything written and unwritten, right? This is an approach which we call in the study of Tanakh and in reading omni-significance, right? We attribute great meaning and intentionality to everything that appears in the Tanakh. No word or letter is without purpose or role. And here, Nehama too bumped up against other schools of thought. There are schools of thought which said, you find a verse repeated in two different locations with a slight variation. That just reflects that we say things, the same thing, different ways, as opposed to why in this chapter would it be with this word, and in that chapter would it be with that word. And the approaches could merge at a certain point where you could say, unwittingly, subconsciously, these variations have deep meaning, but maybe the person, or the being expressing them wasn't actually deliberate in a sense, but there were still subtle forces underlying the variation. But others would say, no, even as our holy book, the Tanakh is a little bit more loose. It's a little bit, not God forbid, flippant, but it's a little bit more laid back in the way it expresses itself. And it doesn't mean mountains and mountains of significance upon every letter or word. But the greater messages and points are what matter most. Nehama was not from that school. She was from the school that really believed that everything was quite intentional, deliberate. The slightest variations had great meaning and importance. Now, that's not to say that she was a believer in mystical interpretation of the text. She didn't really quote from Hasidic teachers or Kabbalah. Not that she didn't attribute importance to that, but she wasn't much of a believer in gematria and numerological interpretations of the text. But she did believe that every word could be mined for its quite precise meaning, usage, and purpose. And that was an important approach of hers, which you see carried through all of her writing. So, between those 2 points, you have the profound importance of the unique individual's experience of reading and interpreting, and you have the framework provided for us by our predecessor commentaries, medieval and modern. And that way, Nehama also, she didn't limit herself to a rabbinic level of interpretation or medieval. She had modern as well. Now, how far and wide did that go is the topic of our next text, the topic of from whom to learn. And here Nehama was pioneering in many ways. And again, I'll say, if we sort of say this is so obvious, it's in part obvious because she made it so. This is a letter she wrote to Rabbi Yehuda Ansbacher of Tel Aviv. He was the rabbi for a number of years of a shul called Ichud Shivtei Yisrael, I believe, which is a storied synagogue in Tel Aviv, which is attempting a revival now. Some of our Bayit young people who've moved to Israel are getting connected to that synagogue. So it circles back around now in the 21st century. She writes this letter to him. He, as she was always corresponding with people and they were always offering their own insights and follow-ups, supports, or challenges to things she wrote, she corresponded with them. And he here must have made a comment to her about somehow the citing of non-traditional commentaries, and he raised some concern about that. And she writes, this is a relatively famous letter of hers. Which we're excerpting here, but we're going to read it a little bit at length, just so you get the flavor and feel of her approach. To the Honorable Rabbi Yehuda Ansbacher, it's a great honor for me that you commented on my words on Parshat Pekudei, and then she gets into some of the back and forth there. And then she says, but more to the point, let me turn to the latter part of your comments. It is true that I cite the words of people who are not observant of the mitzvot, if their words seem correct to me, and can reveal the light of Torah and display its greatness and holiness to the student. I work according to the principle. This is a principle articulated by Rambam, by Maimonides, in his introduction to Pirkei Avot. Kabel et ha'emet mimisha omro. Accept the truth from wherever it comes. What can I say? Benno Jacob was an extreme reformer who served in the Santag Gemeinde and was certainly transgressed an enormous portion of our Holy Torah's mitzvot. Parenthetically, in addition to the fact that he was an anti-Zionist, etc., something she had no truck for. Yet I learned from his books, Auga has excellent proofs that an eye for an eye, according to the simple meaning, refers to monetary compensation. And she quotes another of his writings, which was a forceful work against the documentary hypothesis. Right, so going back before, I learned from his books more than from many books written by bona fide, God-fearing Jews. His claims against biblical criticism and his proofs of their frivolousness and their errors. No one has ever written things better than them, Even Rav David Tzvi Hoffman, Zecher Tzadik Livracha, as difficult as it is to mention the name of this Gaon, that is Rav David Tzvi Hoffman, together with B. Jacob, as well as Yisachar Yakovson and Dr. Muriel, who wrote a work on the Torah. In other words, Beno Jacob was a Reform Jew. He did not observe the mitzvot traditionally in the way that she understood, yet he had profound and tremendous Torah insights, and in many of them better than the traditionalists. How could she not quote from him? And if you read through Nehama's writings, she definitely quotes from him on a number of occasions. Many of my friends, among them Rabbi David Karlebach, who for many years taught with me in the seminar in Jerusalem, also learned from his works. He, Beno Jacob, opened our eyes to see things which we had not seen before, and therefore toward a true understanding of the Torah. Professor Umberto Cassuto, Zichrono Livracha, who was God-fearing and scrupulous regarding the mitzvot, said a number of things that are very far from my belief in Torah Misinai, and I won't be part of their dissemination. And therefore I will not pay heed to who said it, but only to what is said. So now she comes around from the other side. You have Beno Jacob, who is not observant, but firmly entrenched against biblical criticism. Then you have Umberto Cassuto, who accepted some of the academic assumptions in the study of Torah, but was observant of the commandments. She was both. She was profoundly opposed to biblical criticism, to the documentary hypothesis, and she was profoundly observant of all the Torah's commandments. However, someone who fell short on one or the other or both, but had great Torah insights, she learned from them and quoted them. There is no need to say that Martin Buber was not a good Jew, according to the normal understanding of this concept. I knew him, and he was not in any way a man after my heart, absolutely not. However, the story that Gentile wrote seems to me to be slightly far from the truth, whatever it was, some kind of criticism of Buber. At the end of the day, this was not an innocent offhand remark, but rather one made by someone interested in proving a point, whatever the backstory is here. But if it is true, then this shows me, which I already knew, that Buber flattered Gentiles. And if he truly said what is written, this is an abomination. Again, she pulled no punches on her criticisms of people and their statements. Although according to what he said to me, he didn't love Christianity at all and certainly didn't believe in these things. And if he said them, it was in order to flatter the Gentiles. And this is the absolute worst. But what can I do? As I and many religious teachers learned many correct things from him in Tanakh, especially the whole concept of the keyword, the Leitvort, what we call in Hebrew the Milah Mancha. You'll find a passage in the Torah and a certain word recurs. Often it's 7 times, but it could be more or less. And that's meant to be a kind of lodestar or keystone for understanding the theme of the chapter. This is a very important topic. And the deep meaning that its application in Torah hints to. And although our Midrash also recognized this principle, meaning Buber was not the first one to introduce the concept of the Leitvort, right? She puts in parentheses quotes from Midrashic texts, Ne'emar kan v'ne'emar sham, right? It says this word there and here. And similarly, midah keneged midah, measure for measure, connecting concepts. It's nevertheless the merit of Buber, and even more so Rosenzweig, that they expanded this concept and revealed several places that I have not found in any early sources. I will not withhold this good from students by hiding this from them. In truth, even non-Jews, again, you can see her hierarchical, approach. In truth, even non-Jews at times, though in my opinion rarely, offer an interpretation that is good and sharp and proper to present. And even a Bravanel, a medieval commentary, in select places brings the words of a Catholic bishop and accepts his opinion, the Catholic bishop's opinion, over the opinions of Radak and Ralbag, other classic medieval commentators. Several times I showed Talmidei Chachamim, sages, details from Beno Jacob's important book, and they thanked me and rejoiced as if discovering a great treasure. Should I then hide the name of the author? This I cannot do. And she quotes from a passage from the Talmud, who are those whose waters we drink and whose names we don't mention? Meaning, if you draw from the wellspring of someone's knowledge, you acknowledge them. This is my opinion, which I have held to my entire life. I thank you for writing nice things to me about my in the Beit Knesset, and I wish you and your family a happy and kosher Pesach and good health, and may we merit to see a Pesach that brings the rebuilding of the temple. With great respect and thanks for your consideration, Nehama, as she always signed her letter. So again, you hear both profoundly traditional approach. She's skeptical of non-Jewish people and their capacity to have real insight into the Torah. She's deeply opposed to academic scholarship of the Torah and biblical criticism. She's scrupulous in her commandments, and someone who is not, she's prepared to call them out for it and criticize them for those life choices. But all of that said, none of that discredits or or diminishes the desire to which she will learn from anyone if their insights are, ring true and can add to our study and knowledge of Torah. And again, this I think is one of the cruxes of the contribution that she made, because in the circles in which she moved and taught, which included very traditional ones, including the story is told that the Lubavitcher Rebbe sent a number of women to learn with Nehama. He felt that she would be a good teacher for them, and they were very upset. Why are we learning Torah from a woman, right? But so she moved in very traditional circles, and for her students, these would really stretch them philosophically and ideologically to be told, people who didn't keep the commandments or who accepted biblical criticism or non-Jews have insights to the Torah that we should learn and we should credit them properly. And in this way, she really pushed and expanded, I think, the canon of classical Torah study in a deep way. Again, she had her limits, and we might push past those limits. We might say there are profound contributions that, critical scholarship makes to our understanding of the Torah. She was incredibly, not just wary, she was roundly opposed to that. But she made great contributions in expanding, I think, the canon of Torah. Okay, I can see we're short on time. I'm going to try to cover a couple of more central points. I'll just point to what this is, and you can, on the shul's website, or otherwise you can email it, or we'll send around the source sheets. You can see this. This is just an interesting approach she had. She was very much a believer in the idea that the Torah was a more progressive document than its contemporaries. In other words, not that she wasn't interested, although she was knowledgeable, she wasn't interested in spending that much time in archaeology and comparative religion, but she believed that the Torah had insights and ethical progress over and above, Hammurabi's Code and the various ancient Near Eastern works of law of its time. And she sort of carried that forward also to sort of say the Torah's approach to things was often more progressive than other religious faith approaches to things. And here, in one of her weekly Torah study essays on Parshat Ki Teitzei, in a passage that talks about keeping vows, she shows how the sage's approach, and she argues that it's there latent in the text of the Torah, was critical of vow taking in general. This is timely. Our weekly Torah portion this Shabbat, Matot Maseh, begins with a passage about vows. And she argued that while the Torah creates the infrastructure for taking vows, the overall approach is that this is sort of a lesser form, that you take a vow if you don't have faith in yourself, and you wind up restricting things unnecessarily. And here she quotes, we won't read the whole thing, I'll just note it. In this connection, the reader will no doubt be interested, this is at the end of the essay, in the opinion of one of the most distinguished thinkers of our time, the late Mahatma Gandhi, on the subject of vows in his autobiography. She quotes from Gandhi where he talks about how he came to understand the power of vows in resisting temptation and adding on, prohibitions upon ourselves. And she concludes, Gandhi's outlook on vows is very different from the view propounded by the scriptural passages and the Jewish commentators cited in our study. Gandhi puts the man who binds himself by a vow on a pedestal. Our Torah wished man to remain free in those matters not covered by its commands and prohibitions. Man should act in accordance with the dictates of his own mind at the moment of decision, and not be bound by any previously determined resolve or vow. So here, now again, we could also point out that the Torah already makes many, many more laws and rules on us than the world in which Gandhi was living. And so I could understand Gandhi saying, I will place these prohibitions upon myself in the form of a vow. But Nehama's point was, you have your religious rules and guidelines, and then everything else, you don't overly restrict yourself. You have to actually exercise free will in every moment. And in this way, she saw the Torah as sort of more progressive in its embrace of human free will and challenging the human to be their best selves rather than adding on additional restrictions. Just an example of, first of all, her breath. She read Gandhi, and then the way she introduced it in an attempt to, create a, I don't say this in a critical way, but a Torah supremacist sort of view. Again, we could question or challenge that. This was her approach. In addition, and maybe more centrally, I think one of her central approaches was the idea that, after up until this point, having talked about how we read, immerse ourselves, and interpret Torah, now we want to come to the fact that, of course, for her, the Torah, and we've already seen this, was not just a book to be studied, but it is a guide for life. And she, as much as she stayed to the realm of interpretation in her studies on the weekly Parsha, she would also often add a little bit of a kind of a sermonic conclusion, helping us see how the Torah speaks to our daily lives, not just in the commandments of it, but in the philosophy and ethics that underlie it. So in the passage in Shemot about the Miyaldot HaIvriyot, which is alternatively translated either as the Hebrew midwives, or the midwives to the Hebrews, who did civil disobedience and resisted Paro's decree, and didn't throw the babies into the Nile. So the question is, if Miyaldot HaIvriyot means the Hebrew midwives, then they were Hebrews. But if it means the midwives to the Hebrews, then they might have been Egyptians. They might have been Egyptian midwives who practiced civil disobedience against Pharaoh. She brings both opinions, cites a number of commentaries for each, and leaves you a little bit with the flavor that the predominant interpretation, I think, is that they were Hebrews themselves. But she kind of then comes back to sort of resurrect the opinion that they were Egyptian. And she writes, if we accept that the midwives were Egyptian, a very vital message becomes apparent. The Torah indicates how the individual can resist evil. He need not shirk his moral responsibility under the cover of superior orders. The text contrasts the brutal decrees of enslavement and massacre initiated by Pharaoh and supported by government and people with the God-fearing civil disobedience of the midwives. Neither moral courage nor sheer wickedness are ethnically or nationally determined qualities. Moab and Ammon produced a Ruth and a Nehama, respectively. Egypt, two righteous midwives. So here, she, notwithstanding what we said above about her approach to non-Jewish scriptural interpretation, etc., she wants to lift up interpretations which see universal goodness and speak to the idea of every person's capacity to resist evil. Certainly here, she's writing in the shadow, not the immediate, but certainly the long shadow of the Holocaust. And she's asking the question, how do people stand up against oppressive regimes? And how do we recognize that each of us has the capacity to do good even in the face of evil? One thing that I didn't put on the sheet, but I just want to read to you, in her essay in Vayikra, in Parshat Kedoshim, about don't place a stumbling block before a blind person, she gives a series of interpretations, and then she kind of offers some more expansive interpretations that this could apply to lots of settings, even where you're just sort of sitting idly by. You might be causing someone to sin or trip and stumble, and that those are applications of this law, a very expansive interpretation. And she ends, the Torah teaches us that even if you remain totally passive, sitting and doing nothing, even if you distance yourself from communal life or activity, even if you remain confined to your 4 cubits, to your private life, you cannot escape responsibility for communal actions of injustice, violence, and wickedness. The fact that you did not protest and let your voice be heard loudly, that you did not designate graves and other vulnerable places, that's the context of one of the interpretations, that you have to mark a grave so that a priest won't accidentally walk there. The fact that you did not designate graves and other vulnerable places means that you bear responsibility for the evil which has been perpetrated, and you have transgressed. You shall not put a stumbling block before a blind man. Right? So she sees the Torah as calling us all to moral responsibility in many, many ways. I see, I accidentally copied this twice. I'll fix that. The next source, which we won't read here, talks about how she also saw kind of emotional tone in the Torah text as something that was important to read. But broadly, she really understood the Torah as a moral guide for all of us, and that it called us to the highest standards of behavior at all times. And this transitions, we're going to try to go. Feel free to leave if you need to leave. I'm sorry for going a little over. I'm going to try to end by 11:05 or so, and then open up for questions. So just to look at a couple of reflections on her legacy. So here, moving away from her own writings to writings about her. So Yael Unterman, who wrote a long biography of Nehama, but on her on the Jewish Women's Archive, Encyclopedia of Jewish Women, she writes a shorter biography, and she writes, Leibowitz refused to acknowledge that she was a revolutionary in any way, but ultimately her unique achievements changed Orthodox society's perception of a woman's capabilities and undoubtedly opened doors for the female Torah scholars who followed. This itself is proof of the power of gradual evolutionary change. It is this duality of self-definition and deeds that leads to the fact that Leibowitz may be claimed by all camps as their own. She is held up as a beacon of modesty and learning by conservative elements, whilst feminists point to her impact and consider her an important milestone in Jewish women's empowerment. She was very much would not have called herself a feminist. She was very strongly opposed to expansion of women's roles in synagogue life. She was not a proponent of women wearing talit or things like that. She was very skeptical of it, highly traditionalist in that way. But no doubt she was an incredible trailblazer, and women's teachers of Torah in the Orthodox community and beyond, really stand on her shoulders, because she just unassumingly, unabashedly, and unquestioningly taught Torah to any and all at amongst the highest levels, truly the highest levels of Torah teaching. Many great scholars and rabbis called her amongst the greatest Torah teachers of our generation. Okay, just a little bit about her personal kindness, just to show you that she lived the Torah that she taught. And by the way, the English excerpts here, she wrote in Hebrew, and her writings were translated into English, many of them by Aryeh Newman. Okay, just a few tales of Nehama. I'm going to read them here. One cold winter day, a social worker received a phone call from Nehama. Nehama says, "I know you're involved with old people. I'm sitting here in my warm house, but I know there must be elderly people out there who can't afford kerosene for their stoves. If I give you some money, could you see to it that it goes to heat the homes of some unfortunate souls?" Yael Stiefel, this is the interviewer, talking to some of Nehama's students, believes this offer stemmed from Nehama's embarrassment at spending money on herself. Heating her own home was such a luxury that she only felt comfortable doing it if others would also benefit. And another, a very, very typological story. The long-term housekeeper, Nehama had someone who was in her home when she was married, and then after her husband died, a neighbor became a long-term housekeeper for decades, has another story to relate that could be called the mystery of the missing towels. One day, relates Tzipora, this was the neighbor housekeeper and aide of sorts, during the time of rationing, I went into town to buy some underwear and towels for the Leibowitz males, Nehama's father and husband. I put them into the cupboard and was very happy to have gotten such a good deal on them. Next morning, I went to the cupboard to take out a new towel and couldn't find them. Who could have taken them? I asked the cleaning lady, but she didn't have a clue. I asked Nehama's husband, and he also didn't know. When Nehama came home from her teaching schedule, I wasn't there because I did the shopping on Thursday afternoon. When I got back, she'd gone off to another shiur. Here you have just a flavor of Nehama's day, constantly teaching. I went to the cupboard, hoping maybe I'd overlooked the towels the first time, but no, they still weren't there. Finally, when it was getting dark, Nehama came in. Nehama, did you see the new towels that I bought yesterday? I asked. Listen, she told me. Last night, someone came around to collect for Hachnasat Kala, to help a bride. I didn't have any money, so I gave them the towels. How could I be angry with her? And again, for a sense of her going around to teach and her widespread fame, this story. Once Nehama was invited to give a lecture at an army base in the Gush Etzion area. It was in the beginning of the Intifadas, the first Intifadas, going back many decades. An army vehicle was sent to pick her up. At the checkpoint near the base, a soldier stopped them and said, "Sorry, you can't continue on this road now." "But I have a lecturer here who's been invited to give a talk at the base tonight," said the driver. "Sorry, I have instructions not to let anyone through," answered the guard. "But it's Nehama Leibowitz who has to speak," insisted the driver, pointing to Nehama in the back. "Oh, Nehama Leibowitz, why didn't you say so?" said the soldier on duty, and quickly opened the barrier to let them through. Just in closing, a lot has been written about the fact that Nehama was not blessed with children, but that her many, many, many students were all in a way her children. One of her students says that she actually had the class memorize the Rashi in the beginning of Parshat Noach that says that our good deeds are our legacy as much as our children. And Yael Unterman, one of her biographers, writes, all her achievements notwithstanding, the childless Leibowitz confided that she would have given it all up to have children. But at her funeral in 1997, you'll pardon me for being emotional, her nephew announced, all those who feel as I do like a son to Nehama may join in the Kaddish prayer with me. And suddenly from all quarters, thousands of voices rose in unison to say Yitgadal v'Yitkadash Shemei Rabbah. On Nehama's matzeva, on her tombstone, which you have here pictured, at her insistence, besides for her name, Nehama Leibowitz, and the dates of her birth and death, the 3rd of Elul, 5665, to the 5th of Nisan, 5757. Only one word appears, and that is the word Morah, teacher. So it's a privilege to share just a little bit of her story and her writings and her approach with you. And I welcome if anybody wants to share either stories or questions or anything, please. We're going to start with Myrna, who's here with me in person. Yes, Myrna.
I have two short observations. I believe when I was reading the Ten Commandments, Shamor v'Zachor, how do they explain that? The Dibur Echad. It's kind of squishy.
Yes.
And then if I remember correctly, because I learned it so long ago, after Nazir, you're supposed to bring Karban Chatat. Is that correct? So that is saying just what it is. You Chatat is if you've sinned.
Right.
So it isn't a good thing.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So so on that point about the vows, the person who takes the Nazirite vow brings a sin offering, and there's some discussion about why that is. And one approach is that somehow, even while it was, an act of religious obedience or dedication, it was also somehow that self-limiting act of a vow is not an ideal. And yes, certainly, Shamor v'Zachor is, one of many examples of interesting discrepancies in the Torah's account. And there are classical midrashic approaches and rabbinic approaches of how we differentiate, and there are more academic scholarship approaches of how we differentiate, and these are all in different ways parts of the conversation. Let's see, Edith, go ahead if you're able to unmute. See if you can unmute, Edith. We'd love to hear you.
Click on your microphone.
Yeah, if you can click on the little microphone button, but if it's sometimes it's hard to get to that. Okay, while you're working on it, Edith, we'll come to Lance.
First question: How does can you hear me?
Yep.
How does Shira relate to Nehama Leibowitz? Does she have your enthusiasm?
Yeah, absolutely. Shira's also a great aficionado of Nehama and her teachings.
Okay, my second question is, what is Nehama Leibowitz's concept of God? I haven't seen one word about God in any of this.
Yeah, she was a deeply pious believer in God and understood the Torah as God's word. It's an interesting point that we had that hasn't sort of bubbled up here, but I think that's the short answer.
And how would she and Mahatma Gandhi understand Jephthah's story of the vow of Jephthah?
Yeah, fascinating question. Fascinating.
And how would she read the book of Nahum, which has a totally radically different concept of God from the Torah?
All great questions. I don't think I could answer on one foot, but I'm grateful to you for introducing them. Just but pausing to note a couple of things in the comments. Judy asked about what was Nehama's knowledge about the Shoah. It's a very good question. She was living in Israel at the time. I don't have a sense of, I'm not aware of any biographical information about, how she might have been connected to it. But I haven't read all the biographies, so that I don't know. And appreciating, I think Debbie already had to step off, but her comment about, the various things going on in our world today, which need to be called out. Whether Nehama would have the same perspective as any of us on which those things are and how, I can't say. But I think the underlying moral call absolutely is so critical. Estelle, and then Judy.
Yeah, just
Mine
one.
is,
Oh, yes,
I'm-
Edith. Okay, go ahead, Edith. We hear you. Go ahead.
I'm
yeah,
sorry.
okay. It's a silly question, but how is Lashon Hara? How can we say how is this different than Lashon Hara when she talks about people in her letters?
That's an interesting question. That's a very interesting question, right? She's critical
Yes,
of people's practice or beliefs.
right.
That's a really interesting question. First I would say it's in context of a greater purpose, which is why she's ultimately attempting to defend why their Torah can be heard in spite of the things which she criticizes. I don't have a good answer to that, right? Because certainly, I guess I would say there are different approaches to what precisely qualifies as Lashon Hara. Some people have a more expansive approach where even stating facts, that are they're simply true, but they are critical, is problematic. Nehama was scrupulous about these things, so I can only imagine that she would have an answer for you about why she felt it was warranted. But I hear it. Certainly, there's strong condemnation in her letters of people and their beliefs or practices. That's true. I think she would call it Milchamta shel Torah, kind of the battle around Torah. But I appreciate that comment. I really do.
I enjoyed the presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Estelle?
Yeah, two things. It took me a half hour to get into your lecture, and I'm sorry I missed the first half because I just really felt very frustrated. But
We're going to try to fix that. Thank
The
you.
newsletter is not around.
Yeah,
No,
we're working on
but
all those
what-
things. I apologize for that lapse, and we're working on it.
But what I wanted to ask is, where did she live?
I'm embarrassed that I'm not certain. I think she lived in Yerushalayim when she was in Israel. I believe so.
And what did her husband do? I find this all has to be sort of coming together, really.
Yes.
What did her husband do?
I'm not sure off the top of my head.
Uh-huh. And where is she buried?
That's another good question, which I don't know the answer to off the top of my head. I assume I had to guess. I would guess Har HaZeitim, but I'm not certain. I'm going to jot these things down. So hold on a moment.
And one more question, Stephen.
Yes.
I really admired and enjoyed the lecture of Shira last week, and I wanted to ask, could you give me a copy of Spiegel's discussion between truth and legend?
Hi, is this Adam?
Truth and legend.
Yeah.
Hello, this is Edith. I'm calling you back.
Yeah. So I just wanted to those
Great.
things. Thank you.
Thank you for the homework. I will be back in touch with some answers. And coming to Judy. You're muted, Judy. Go ahead and unmute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we do.
Okay. I just have to make you laugh. Anyway, so I have two comments, including a question. I was privileged to know Leah Abramowitz. I actually volunteered as a social worker at Shari Tzedek Hospital, where she was a full social worker in the years between 1981 and 1982. And I was even a guest in her home on a Shabbos. She lives in the old city, and she had maybe 10 children, so organized, one taking care of the other and taking care of the other. I would be most interested in reading her book, Tales of Nehama. Is there a copy in the Bayit?
There's not a copy in the bite, but I would be happy to loan you mine.
The other comment that I want to say is, having had the zechus of learning Torah with Rav Avi, he always referred to her as my Rebbe. So,
Yeah.
in terms of the history of the Bayit, since he was the founder, since he refers to hers as my Rebbe, I guess she would be the ultimate founder of the Bayit.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Thank you for those comments. Just going, before we come to more comments, I see more hands are just coming to the chat. Thank you to Miriam, who writes, I had the great honor of being a student of Nehama in 1957 and 1958. I was part of a group of graduating Hebrew teachers. I loved her, as did all the students in our class at the Chaim Greenberg Teachers Institute. As you mentioned, she taught Ivrit Be'Ivrit, and she taught in Yerushalayim, so I assume she lived there. She came to school on a bicycle every morning.
Yeah.
Lance asked about marriage to her uncle. That's actually Torah permitted. And in fact, in rabbinic literature, there's I think if I remember right, it's a Tosefta in Kiddushin. You could look it up, Lance. I think it's a Tosefta in the first chapter of Kiddushin that says a woman should marry her uncle or otherwise a different fitting suitor. So again, these are not necessarily our practice 21st century conventions, but that absolutely was a Torah and rabbinically permitted marriage. Hold on, Myrna,
Okay.
up to a couple more. Let's see. I see Elaine and Barbara. Go ahead, Elaine.
Yes, this is kind of trite, but I just wanted to add that I heard she always wore brown, and that's in the picture as
Yeah.
well.
Yes. One tone dark colors was her most frequent, but she has just a little bit, you found a little bit of pattern, but certainly simplicity was
And
one
her
of her.
beret, her
Yes.
brown beret.
Yes.
Oh,
Yes.
well.
Yes. Barbara, more you
So
wanted to say?
I studied with her at Hebrew U. I had two classes. This is 1971, 72, one in commentators and one in Breshit. And she told, this is so typical of her humor. She told a very cool story about why is God asking Aye Hevel Achicha
Where
to
is that one, brother? Yeah.
Abel, and it's God. Doesn't he know what happened? So she gave her example, and she had a lovely British accent. And she said, so you're standing by the side of the road with a flat, and someone drives by and says, have you got a flat? So she said, what is he, dumb? You can see
Yeah.
he's got a flat. And what she compares that to is God's way of easing into a conversation in the same way as the man with the flat. So very, very charming, wonderful teacher. Now here's a show and tell item. Oh, I'm blurred. Okay, I got a book this past April in Israel. It's called Morah B'Chesed, the story of Nehama Leibowitz in Hebrew. I have grandchildren. Let me see if I can unblur. Probably not. Wait. Here we go.
Yes.
Nehama Leibowitz. It's from the Rav Kook Institute, and they do stories. The Rav Kook volume is wonderful. So it confirms all the stories about her chesed. She had a student once who had to drop out of the class because she had to work. She was a cleaning person. She lived far away. She couldn't do the commute and come to the class. So Nehama realized this is a really smart woman and should be given the opportunity to learn. So she used to travel out to her in one of the settlement towns, I believe once a week, and learn with her, and then travel back to Jerusalem. So that story is in that book about her chesed. So
thank you for the stories and the recommendations. Wonderful. I do know that series. We have a couple of books in that series. They're really delightful. Who else was waiting? Is there a hand? Okay. Okay, so thank you to everyone.
Did she never write in English?
I'm not aware of her writings in English, but again, as you can see, I have some gaps in my knowledge, so there certainly may be. Just delighted to have everyone who joined. There are a few people on whom I don't know well, so thank you so much for coming, and please feel welcome to join any of our classes, and feel free to be in touch with me, and to tribute to Nehama that she brings a wide group and may we continue to learn her Torah directly and follow in so many of the different models that she laid out for us. So thanks to all. Love to Mom and Dad.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.